You are lying still now, letting your body soften and your breathing become calm. Imagine yourself centuries ago in the quiet of an ancient Greek evening. The stars are faint pinpricks above the Mediterranean, and the air carries a subtle warmth. It is in this world, long before written words shaped libraries, that the people of Greece began to tell their stories. They did not call them mythology, as we do today. To them, these tales were simply explanations of why the world existed, who governed it, and why human life carried both beauty and suffering. The beginnings of Greek mythology are not tied to a single author or one precise moment. Instead, they grew from the long oral traditions of countless storytellers, farmers, sailors, travelers, who repeated and reshaped what they had heard. These early myths were told by firelight, sung in markets, or recited at festivals. They were not designed as entertainment alone. They were, above all, a way to make sense of the unknown. Why does the earth shake? Why does lightning strike? Why do crops fail or thrive? The answers came not in the form of cold explanations, but in the shape of beings, gods, titans, and forces that gave character to nature itself. At the very beginning, before the gods you may recognize, before Zeus with his thunderbolt, before Poseidon ruling the seas, there was simply chaos. The Greek word chaos does not mean disorder in its modern sense. It was more like an emptiness, a yawning gap, a vast nothingness. Imagine the deep silence before dawn, before the first bird begins to sing. That was chaos, a void that held potential but no form. Out of this emptiness emerged Gaia, the earth. Gaia was not described as a goddess in a human sense, at least not at first. She was the very ground itself, the fertile soil, the mountains, the valleys, and all the life that could spring from her. Gaia was stability, a surface upon which the future could rest. To the Greeks, the earth was not inert. It was alive, nourishing, and capable of giving birth to gods and creatures alike. With Gaia came Uranus, the sky. If you have ever watched how the horizon holds the heavens in place, you can imagine how the Greeks pictured the earth and sky as partners locked together. Uranus covered Gaia, and together they produced the Titans, giant, powerful beings who represented vast concepts of nature and time. Oceanus, who embodied the endless river that the Greeks believed circled the world. Hyperion, tied to the light of the sun. Cronus, who would become linked with time itself. Each Titan was less of a character and more of a force, a way to imagine the invisible yet undeniable structures of existence. When you think about these myths, it is easy to imagine only the stories of gods battling or plotting. Yet in their earliest form, they were more like meditations, gentle reflections on how life emerged. They were not rushed, not hurried. A storyteller could linger for hours describing the vastness of the sky, the richness of the soil, or the strange, almost human-like qualities of the seas. This slowness suited evenings by the fire, when no one was in a hurry to explain, but rather wished to be immersed in a world that felt both familiar and mysterious. As Gaia and Uranus continued to create, their children multiplied. The Hecatomcheires, beings with 100 hands, and the Cyclopes, giants with a single eye. These figures may seem bizarre, but they served as explanations for natural phenomena. The Cyclops, for example, were later linked with the power of volcanoes, single, fiery eyes glaring from the mountains. In telling of them, the Greeks gave a kind of personality to forces that might otherwise feel overwhelming. Now imagine if you were a farmer in ancient Greece, tilling the soil with wooden tools, your survival depending entirely on the moods of the land. You would look at Gaia not as a myth, but as the mother of your crops, the provider of your grain and olives. If storms destroyed your field, you might imagine Uranus as displeased, withholding his gentler rains. These myths were not far removed from reality. They were woven directly into the daily rhythm of survival. The Titans themselves became symbols of both the strength and the unpredictability of the natural world. Oceanus was endless, flowing water, far beyond what any Greek sailor could chart. Mnemosyne, another Titan, represented memory, the act of keeping stories alive. The very idea that remembrance itself was divine shows how important storytelling was. Without memory, myths would vanish. Without myths, the world would be silent, without explanation. But myths also served another purpose. They comforted. To think that the vast, indifferent forces of nature were actually part of a family, a lineage of beings with intentions, moods, and personalities, made the world less frightening. When thunder rolled across the mountains, it was not random. It was a voice. When crops grew lush and green, it was a gift. By wrapping reality in stories, people could rest more easily, even when they didn't fully understand. This is the gentle beginning of Greek mythology. Not battles, not heroes, but an awakening. A movement from emptiness to presence, from chaos to Gaia, from silence to a world filled with beings that gave meaning to what otherwise might have been only fear. Yet this was only the beginning, for soon the harmony between Gaia and Uranus would fracture. Uranus, fearful of his powerful children, would attempt to suppress them. From this act of control would rise the first true conflict, one that would shape the course of myth forever.
You may imagine, as you settle deeper into your pillow, that the world of myth is not unlike a household, grand, strange, but familiar in its rhythms. At first, the household of Gaia and Uranus was filled with growth. Children were born, the earth was fertile, and the sky watched over them like a vast protective dome. Yet, as often happens in families, power and fear began to mingle. Uranus looked upon his children, the Titans, the Cyclops, and the Hecatonkes, with suspicion. Some were too powerful, too strange, and he dreaded the thought of being displaced by them. Fear is a quiet thing at first, but in Uranus it grew, pressing into every corner of his being. Instead of letting his children roam free, he hid them away, forcing them back into the depths of Gaia herself. For Gaia, this was unbearable. Imagine the weight of carrying within you vast and unruly forces, unable to release them. The earth groaned under the strain, as if mountains themselves ached from within. Gaia, once a motherly source of stability, now became restless. It was said that she forged a great sickle, crafted of unyielding stone, and called upon her children to rise against their father. But not all were willing. To strike against Uranus was unthinkable. He was the sky itself, ever present, and to oppose him meant disturbing the order of all things. Only one son, Cronus, stepped forward. Calm, patient, and calculating, Cronus took up the sickle. He became the agent of change, and through his act, time itself would begin to matter. When Uranus descended to be with Gaia once more, Cronus ambushed him. With the stone sickle, he severed his father, separating sky from earth. The detail may sound violent, but in myth it was symbolic. The world was no longer a single suffocating unity. Sky and earth were parted, distinct, free to exist without smothering one another. Out of Uranus' spilled essence, strange new beings emerged, the Furies, the giants, and most notably, Aphrodite, who would later embody love and desire. What is important here is not the act itself, but its consequence. For the Greeks, this moment explained why the heavens and the earth, though close, no longer touched as they once did. It was a way of imagining distance, of making sense of why the ground is solid beneath your feet while the sky remains forever out of reach. Cronus now, the leader of the Titans, ruled in his father's place. Yet his reign was not one of simple peace. He carried within him the same fear that had plagued Uranus, the fear of being overthrown by his own children. Time, which Cronus represented, is both giver and destroyer. It allows growth, but it also consumes. Perhaps the Greeks sensed in this myth that every generation must give way to the next, and that no rule, whether of gods or men, could last forever. Cronus took for his consort Rhea, his sister, and together they produced children who would later become the Olympians: Hestia, Demeter, Hera, Hades, Poseidon, and finally Zeus. Yet, haunted by the prophecy that he would be overthrown, Cronus devoured each child as soon as they were born. Imagine, if you will, the strangeness of such an image. Newborns consumed by their father, not out of hunger, but out of dread. Rhea's grief was immense, and yet she endured in silence for a time. The Greeks knew well the weight of silent endurance. Their lives often depended on patience, in farming, in sailing, in withstanding long summers and cold winters. But patience, too, has limits. When Rhea conceived her sixth child, she devised a plan. She gave birth to Zeus in secret, far away in a cave on the island of Crete, and instead of handing the infant to Cronus, she presented him with a swaddled stone. Cronus, unsuspecting, swallowed the rock, believing he had prevented the prophecy once again. Meanwhile, the infant Zeus was nurtured in hiding, fed on the milk of a divine goat, and protected by attendants who drowned out his cries with the clash of shields. In this way, the future king of the gods was raised quietly, far from his father's gaze. When you listen to this story in the stillness of night, you may notice how it is less about battles and more about cycles: parents fearing children, time giving birth to the new, and the inevitability of change. The Greeks were not simply telling of gods, but reflecting on the patterns of life itself. Every farmer knew that crops must die before new ones could rise. Every family knew that children would one day take the place of their parents. In the myth of Cronus and Zeus, these truths were magnified into divine drama. It is worth pausing to notice how much detail the Greeks gave to these transitions. They did not rush from chaos to Zeus in a single leap. Rather, they lingered over each generation, giving thought to how one order replaced another. For them, the past mattered. To understand why Zeus ruled the heavens, one had to first understand the Titans. And to understand the Titans, one had to begin with Gaia and Uranus. Every stage was a layer of memory, carefully preserved. This is one of the reasons myths became so deeply tied to rituals and festivals. By retelling the old stories, the Greeks honored not only the gods, but also the passage of time itself. Storytelling was a form of remembrance, a way to keep the chain of generations unbroken. As you let your thoughts drift, you might consider the symbolism of Cronus, a god of time who devours his own children. Time nurtures, but it also consumes. Days pass, seasons change, and nothing remains untouched. The Greeks found both comfort and unease in this truth, and through myth they gave it shape. Cronus was not a distant abstraction. He was a figure with fears, choices, and consequences. Yet the story does not end here. For though Cronus believed he had secured his rule, Zeus was growing in secret. The cave on Crete was not only a shelter, but a promise. that the old order would one day yield to the new. What would happen when Zeus came of age? How could a single hidden child overturn the power of the Titans?
You are resting now, and so too the ancient world rests in its slow rhythms. Yet somewhere, hidden in the folds of myth, a child grows quietly in secret. This child is Zeus, the son of Cronus and Rhea, concealed away in a cave upon the rugged island of Crete. The cave itself, known in some traditions as the Dictaean cave, was no ordinary shelter. Its walls glistened with moisture, and the air carried the cool stillness of stone. To imagine Zeus's childhood, you must first picture the land around him: olive groves stretching across hills, goats grazing on rocky pastures, and the distant sound of waves against the Cretan shore. Though the islanders of later centuries built shrines and offered sacrifices in his honor, the myth insists that his infancy was hidden, fragile, and uncertain. To keep him safe, Rhea entrusted him to the care of nymphs, gentle guardians tied to the wild places of the earth. Among them were Adrastea and Ida, who nursed the infant with the milk of Amalthea, a divine goat. Amalthea's presence is more than a simple detail. To the Greeks, goats were symbols of endurance. They thrived on poor soil, climbing steep mountains where other animals could not. For Zeus to be fed on goat's milk was to be nourished by resilience itself. The nymphs faced a constant challenge. Zeus's cries could betray his hiding place. To mask the sound, they enlisted the Curetes, armed dancers who clashed their bronze shields together in rhythmic patterns. The noise was not harsh, but ceremonial, almost like the steady beat of drums at a distant festival. The Curetes leapt and struck their weapons, creating a protective soundscape that mingled with the winds of Crete. To those nearby, it would seem like ritual rather than concealment. Imagine for a moment the careful repetition of this act. Day after day, the same steps, the same metallic ring, the same effort to preserve a fragile secret. It is not unlike the small, patient habits that filled Greek daily life: grinding grain each morning, weaving threads into cloth, or drawing water from a well. Each action may have felt repetitive, yet each one mattered. Survival was found not in sudden acts of glory, but in steady persistence. As Zeus grew, he became aware of his difference. He was not merely another child of earth and sky, but one destined to challenge the order of things. The myths tell us little of his boyhood, but we may imagine him wandering the slopes of Crete, watching eagles circle overhead and listening to the sea's endless murmur. The Greeks often connected Zeus with eagles, not only for their majesty, but also for their ability to see further than other creatures. In time, Zeus came to know of his siblings, lost within the body of Cronus. Each one represented an essential part of the world: Hestia, goddess of the hearth; Demeter, of the harvest; Hera, of family and marriage; Hades, of the underworld; and Poseidon, of the sea. To imagine them trapped, swallowed, and held in silence is to imagine a world unfinished, its elements waiting to be released: the hearth unlit, the harvest untended, the seas restless, the underworld voiceless. Without them, life felt incomplete. Zeus did not rush towards his destiny. Like all in myth, his journey unfolded with patience. He first needed allies, beings who would support his cause. Among these was Metis, a Titaness known for her wisdom. Metis's name itself means cunning thought or craft. She counseled Zeus to act not with brute force, but with cleverness, for Cronus was powerful and watchful. Together, they devised a plan. Metis prepared a potion, a mixture both subtle and transformative. It was said to cause Cronus to release what he had swallowed, but such a plan required courage. Zeus, still young, would need to approach his father not as an enemy, but as if in service. You may imagine the scene. Zeus, grown to adulthood, standing before Cronus. He offers the potion, disguised as a drink. Cronus, unknowing, accepts. The mixture takes hold, and soon the great Titan is seized with nausea. One by one he disgorges the children he had swallowed. They emerge whole, not infants, but in their full strength, as if time itself had paused for them. Hestia, Demeter, Hera, Hades, and Poseidon stand once more in the world, bewildered but free. This moment is one of renewal, a second birth for the Olympians. It is a striking image, siblings reunited not through natural birth, but through release, as though hidden potential had suddenly been restored. For the Greeks, such stories reflected the cycles they saw in nature. Seeds buried deep in the soil seemed gone, yet after rain and sun they rose again as living plants. So too did Zeus's siblings emerge, hidden for a time, only to return with force. Now the world stood on the edge of transformation. The Olympians, newly freed, recognized Zeus as their leader, not because he was the eldest, but because he had acted with resolve. In Greek society, leadership often came not from birth order, but from demonstrated ability. A farmer might respect the elder of the household, but in times of crisis, it was the one who acted decisively who guided the family. Zeus had done what no other dared, and thus he became the center around which his siblings gathered. But the Titans still ruled. Cronus remained powerful, and his brothers and sisters were vast beings tied to elemental forces. To rise against them would mean more than a quarrel within a family. It would be a war that spanned heaven, earth, and sea. But Titanomachy had not yet begun, for now the air was still. It was the stillness before storm clouds gather, the quiet before winds rise. The Greeks who told these stories understood that anticipation itself carried weight. A listener might lean forward, wondering how the battle would unfold. Yet for the moment, the story lingered in preparation, building slowly toward what must come.
When you think of war in mythology, you might imagine sudden clashes, thunder in the skies, or fiery destruction. Yet the Titanomachy, the war between the Olympians and the Titans, was remembered not only for its violence, but also for its length. It was said to last for 10 years. A decade of battle is not a swift strike, but a slow, wearing struggle, much like the turning of seasons, each year blending into the next. Before the first blows were struck, both sides prepared. Preparation was not glamorous, it was tedious, repetitive, and necessary. For the Titans, this meant gathering their forces upon Mount Othrys, a massif rising across central Greece. They called upon their brothers and sisters, beings of immense strength and elemental ties. For the Olympians, stationed upon Mount Olympus, it meant organizing themselves into a new kind of order. Mount Olympus was not yet the shining home of the gods that it would later become. It was simply a mountain, but its height and distance from ordinary human life gave it symbolic weight. The Olympians gathered there as if to claim it by their presence. Zeus stood among them, his thunderbolt a new and strange weapon, while Poseidon tested the weight of the trident, and Hades adjusted the helm that rendered him unseen. Both mountains, Othrys and Olympus, became watchpoints,
like two chessboards set across from one another. Between them stretched the landscape of Thessaly, the plains and rivers that would bear the battles. Farmers who later told these myths perhaps knew those same fields well, remembering how the soil yielded grain, and imagining it once echoing with the steps of gods and giants. The first clashes were not decisive. Skirmishes broke out in valleys and along riverbanks. Titans hurled boulders, tearing them from mountainsides, while Olympians returned lightning, waves, and sudden assaults. The Cyclopes fought at Zeus's side, their one great eye focused not on glory, but on the steady rhythm of combat. The 100-handed ones, Briareus, Cottus, and Gyges, also joined, their many arms allowing them to hurl stones in endless repetition, like men at a threshing floor, casting grain into the wind. But war, even divine war, is not fought in a single day. Each side retreated, regrouped, and returned. Days blurred into weeks, weeks into months. Time became a slow grind. The stories tell us little of the individual battles, for their sameness was part of the tale. What mattered was not a single victory or loss, but the endurance to persist through year after year. For the Titans, the war was also a test of pride. They were beings of the old order, ancient as stone, and they could not conceive of defeat. Cronus, their leader, stood grim and unyielding. Yet his confidence was not complete. He had once swallowed his children to avoid being overthrown, and that memory lingered like an old scar. To fight against them now was to admit that fate still circled him, unrelenting. For the Olympians, the war was a test of legitimacy. Could they truly claim the right to rule, or would they falter under the weight of centuries? They were younger, less experienced, but youth also brought resilience. They adapted, changed tactics, and leaned on one another. Unlike the Titans, who were often solitary in nature, the Olympians acted as a family. Hera and Demeter tended to the others, ensuring that in the pauses between battles, there was food, rest, and counsel. Even in myth, sustenance was never far from thought. Bread had to be broken, water fetched, fires lit. Picture, if you will, the long nights between clashes. The Olympians sat upon Olympus, the air crisp, the stars unblinking above. They would have spoken quietly, perhaps recalling their strange births, perhaps reminding one another of the justice of their cause. The Titans, meanwhile, brooded upon Othrys, the silence heavy. Each camp waited for dawn, knowing the same pattern would repeat: battle, retreat, silence, and return. This rhythm, though monotonous, is at the heart of the Titanomachy. 10 years of war is a mythic way of saying, change does not come quickly. The old order does not yield in an instant. The new order does not establish itself in a moment. Both must endure long stretches of uncertainty. The Greeks who told these stories understood such patience. Crops took months to ripen, voyages could last seasons, and families endured years of hardship. The myth was a reflection of life's slow transformations. Throughout these years, Zeus grew into his role. At first, he was simply the one who freed his siblings, but as months passed into years, he became something more. He became a commander, not only of gods but of strategies. He learned when to unleash the thunderbolt and when to wait. He understood that storms strike hardest not when constant, but when sudden after long silence. Poseidon, too, learned the depth of his trident's power, not only in hurling waves, but in stirring fear. The sea was both gift and danger to the Greeks. They respected its bounty, but dreaded its unpredictability. With the trident, Poseidon embodied that same duality, nourishment and destruction in one. Hades, meanwhile, discovered the usefulness of his helm of invisibility. In the chaos of battle, he could slip unseen, unsettle foes, and vanish once more. Though his role seemed shadowy, it reflected the unseen forces of the world, the undercurrents of fate, the inevitability of death, and the quiet persistence of what lies beneath. The longer the war continued, the more the Olympians grew into the roles that would define them. The Titans, conversely, seemed increasingly bound to their old ways. Cronus held fast, unwilling to change. Some Titans fought loyally, yet others hesitated, their certainty shaken by the persistence of the younger gods. And so the war lingered. Year followed year. Seasons passed, marked not by farming, but by divine combat. The people who later told these myths could almost imagine the Olympians and Titans waging war in rhythm with their own lives, sowing in spring, fighting in summer, resting in winter. After nearly a decade, it became clear that endurance alone would not end the conflict. The Olympians needed not only persistence, but decisive force. Zeus began to plan more carefully, seeking the moment when the war could be brought to a close. He looked not only to his siblings, but also to the 100-handed ones, whose might was greater than even the Titans could withstand. Their many arms could hurl stones without tiring, a ceaseless barrage that even Cronus himself could not endure forever. The stage was slowly being set for a final clash, one that would decide the fate of heaven and earth. Yet even as that moment approached, the rhythm of waiting, clashing, and retreating continued, like the slow ticking of a clock towards an inevitable hour. And it is here, in this quiet before the storm's true breaking, that we must pause. The Titans still stand upon Othrys, proud and unyielding. The Olympians remain on Olympus, steadfast and determined. The war stretches on, year after year, each side clinging to its vision of order. But when the final confrontation comes, who will prevail? The ancient powers of the Titans, or the rising promise of the Olympians?
The Titanomachy, though long and grinding, could not stretch on forever. 10 years of weary struggle had drained both sides. The Titans grew restless, some uncertain whether Cronus truly held the strength to secure victory. The Olympians, though younger, had grown sharper with every season of battle. What began as survival had become strategy, and strategy was beginning to turn the tide. It is said that Zeus, after much waiting, chose his moment. He had endured years of repetition, of boulders hurled and lightning loosed, of advances and retreats. Now he was ready to strike in a way that could not be undone. The 100-handed ones, long kept in shadow, were called forth with purpose. Briareus, Cottus, and Gyges each lifted their many arms, not in ceremony, but in steady readiness. These beings had once been hidden deep within Gaia, too strange and too immense to walk freely. Now they would prove the weight of their existence. The battle opened like many before it, with Titans hurling stones from Mount Othrys, shaking the valleys with their blows. But this time, the Olympians did not merely respond in kind. Zeus raised his thunderbolt, the weapon forged for him by the Cyclopses, and hurled it with force unlike any before. Where it struck, the ground burned white-hot, and the air itself seemed to split. The sound rolled across the plain like a wave breaking endlessly, not once, but over and over, echoing into every ravine. Poseidon followed with the surge of his trident, striking the earth so that waters leapt from hidden springs. Rivers swelled, turning fields into torrents that washed against the Titan strongholds. Hades, unseen, slipped into their ranks, striking silently, leaving confusion in his wake. And above it all, the 100-handed ones began their assault. Each lifted 100 boulders at once, casting them in volleys so relentless that even the Titans could not endure. It was not a matter of single strength, but of endless persistence, stone after stone, wave after wave. The war that had dragged for a decade suddenly began to tilt. The Titans, once immovable, staggered. Cronus, proud and grim, stood at their head, yet the prophecy he had long feared pressed heavily upon him. He had devoured his children to prevent this moment, and now those very children stood united against him. The clash was not remembered in detail so much as in scale. The sky flashed with storms, the earth shook with tremors, and the sea boiled with Poseidon's wrath. For the Greeks who later recited these myths, such descriptions were not mere exaggeration. They were reflections of the natural forces they knew well. Lightning storms sweeping across mountains, earthquakes shattering towns, waves rising without warning. In myth, these became the weapons of gods, but to listeners, they were also reminders of the power that surrounded daily life. Bit by bit, the Titans gave ground. The Olympians pressed forward, their youth and unity carrying them. The 100-handed ones battered down the walls of Othrys, tearing stone apart with ceaseless arms. Cronus and his allies were forced back, retreating toward the edges of the world. And then came the moment of capture. One by one, the Titans were seized and bound. Chains forged by the Cyclopses held them fast, their links as heavy as mountains. The Titans, who had once seemed eternal, were now prisoners. Zeus did not choose to destroy them outright. Instead, he cast them into Tartarus, the deepest pit of the underworld. There, surrounded by bronze gates and encircled by darkness as vast as night itself, they were confined. The 100-handed ones stood as their guards, ensuring that the old powers would never rise again. Tartarus was more than a prison. It was a symbol. The old order had not been erased, but contained, held beneath the earth, where it could no longer dominate. For the Greeks, this mirrored life itself. The past is never gone. It remains below, remembered and felt, but it does not rule. The future rises, but always with the weight of what came before. With the Titans cast down, the war ended. The world was left altered not only in rule, but in shape. Zeus took his place as king of the gods, his thunderbolt now a sign not of rebellion, but of authority. Poseidon received dominion over the seas, his trident marking the waters as his realm. Hades was given the underworld, ruling the unseen spaces below. His sisters, too, found their roles, Hera as queen and guardian of marriage, Demeter as giver of harvests, and Hestia as keeper of the hearth. The Olympians, through war and patience, had claimed the heavens and the earth. Yet victory was not only theirs. It was also a reflection of time's steady passing. The younger had replaced the older, just as crops replace the stubble of last year's fields, and children replace parents in the household. Myth made divine what humans already knew to be true. Nothing stands still forever. The Titanomachy, remembered across generations, was not merely a tale of gods hurling stones and thunder. It was a meditation on change, on the slowness of fate, and on the inevitability of transition. To fall asleep to this story is to hear not only of battle, but of patience, the patience to endure years of struggle, the patience to wait for the right moment, and the patience to accept that even the strongest order eventually yields. And yet, one cannot help but wonder, though the Titans were cast into Tartarus, did their presence vanish from the minds of men? Or did they remain, lurking in memory, shaping fears of what lies beneath the earth, in the deep places beyond sight?
With the Titans bound and confined deep within Tartarus, silence returned to the world. It was not an immediate silence,
but one that settled gradually, like dust after a long storm. The mountains, once shaken by the clash of stones and thunder, stood still again. The rivers ran clear, no longer clouded by battle. Even the air itself seemed calmer, as though the very sky breathed more easily without the weight of endless war. For the first time in 10 years, the Olympians stood not as rebels, but as rulers. Yet victory brought its own questions. To win was one matter, to govern was another. The cosmos, vast and layered, had to be ordered, divided, and maintained. Without careful arrangement, the same chaos that had once filled the earliest age might return. Zeus, as leader, proposed a fair division. The 3 brothers, Zeus, Poseidon, and Hades, would cast lots to determine their realms. Chance, rather than force, would decide the order, for even among gods, fairness carried weight. The casting of lots itself was a familiar act to the Greeks. Farmers drew lots for portions of land, sailors cast them for tasks aboard ship. In choosing by chance, they saw not randomness, but the hand of fate. The lots fell in this way. Zeus received the heavens, the open sky with its clouds, winds, and storms. Poseidon was given the sea, with all its depths, tides, and uncharted expanses. Hades, in turn, took the underworld, the unseen realm of the dead, hidden beneath the earth. The division was complete, and yet the earth itself was left as common ground, a place where all 3 powers touched. This arrangement reflected balance. No one god ruled everything, and no one realm was without purpose. To the Greeks this was vital. The sky gave rain, the sea carried ships, and the earth produced crops. But beneath it all lay the underworld, the quiet reminder of mortality. Each space had its ruler, and each ruler had limits. The sisters, too, found their domains, though less through lots than through their natural roles. Hera, queen beside Zeus, embodied the dignity and order of marriage, binding families together just as divine order bound the cosmos. Demeter took to the fields, her presence in every stalk of wheat, every fruiting vine. Through her, humans found sustenance. Hestia, the eldest, kept the hearth, quiet, humble, but essential. Every home, whether palace or cottage, carried her presence in its fire, the glow that warmed and fed. Together, these arrangements transformed victory into governance. For the Greeks who told these tales, such divisions explained the rhythms of daily life. Why did the sea behave as it did? Poseidon ruled it. Why did crops grow or fail? Demeter's mood decided. Why must all eventually die? Because Hades kept the underworld, steady and impartial. These were not abstract ideas, but explanations woven into existence itself. Yet, for all the calm of division, unease lingered. Tartarus held the Titans, but their memory remained. Some whispered of their strength, of Cronus who once reigned, and of the possibility that old powers might one day return. The 100-handed ones guarded the gates, their many arms tireless, but the very act of guarding suggested that threats endured. Order was not absolute. It was maintained, like a field that must be weeded or a fire that must be fed. The Olympians themselves had much to learn about their new roles. Zeus, high upon Olympus, now had to balance authority with restraint. His thunderbolt, once a weapon of rebellion, became a symbol of justice. He could no longer hurl it freely, for rule required more than force. To be king of the gods was not simply to command, but to maintain harmony, a task requiring patience and measure. Poseidon discovered the burdens of the sea. Though vast and powerful, it was restless, never still.
Fishermen relied on calm waters, but storms could destroy in an instant. To govern the sea meant accepting its duality, both giver and taker. His trident was not only a weapon, but a tool of control, a way to steady the waves or unleash them when balance was disturbed. Hades, in his dark realm, found his rule both lonely and essential. Few sought his company, yet all eventually came under his care. To him fell the responsibility of order among the dead, ensuring that souls rested, that the underworld remained a place of structure rather than chaos. Though feared, his role was one of stability, necessary for the living to carry on without dread of wandering spirits. The sisters, too, embodied the subtler but no less vital aspects of divine order. Hera's role in marriage reflected the importance of bonds, between husband and wife, between family members, between community and tradition. Demeter's cycles of growth mirrored the patience of agriculture. Hestia's hearth reminded all that even the smallest flame could hold the heart of a household. From Olympus, the gods looked out upon the world they now ruled. It was a world of balance, yet fragile. The scars of the Titanomachy remained. Mountains split by thunder, valleys carved by torrents, seas reshaped by upheaval. To the Greeks, such scars explained the ruggedness of their land. The myths made sense of the jagged coasts, the sudden storms, the unpredictable harvests. The world bore the memory of war, just as families bore the memory of hardship. And so the Olympians stood, not only as victors, but as caretakers of a cosmos always in motion. Their rule was a beginning, not an end. For though the Titans had fallen, other challenges lay ahead. Giants, monsters, and the uncertainties of fate itself still lingered beyond the horizon. The Titanomachy had decided who ruled, but it had not ended the need for vigilance. Order, once established, demanded constant tending. Just as a farmer must return year after year to till the same soil, the gods would need to uphold their places again and again. And perhaps this is why the Greeks retold these stories at festivals and feasts. To speak of the division of realms was not simply to remember the past, but to affirm the present, that the sky, sea, earth, and underworld all remained in their proper order, each governed by its rightful power. Yet a question lingers in the quiet of this tale. With victory secured and realms divided, would the Olympians themselves remain united, or would the seeds of discord, subtle and unseen, begin to grow among them in time?
The defeat of the Titans was a turning point, yet it was not the end of struggle. For the Greeks, the world was never static. Victory, even the most decisive, was only a pause before the next test. Just as fields once harvested must be plowed again, or seas once crossed must be navigated anew, so too the reign of the Olympians was immediately challenged. The first threat rose from the very earth itself. From the blood of Uranus, spilled long ago when Cronus struck him with the sickle, new beings had been born, the giants. They were immense and wild, with feet rooted in the strength of the earth and bodies that towered above mortals and gods alike. Unlike the Titans, who were tied to time and ancestry, the giants embodied raw disruption. They were not bound by order, but by the urge to overturn it. The giants did not rise all at once. They emerged in different places, each tied to the ruggedness of the land. Some were said to inhabit mountain ranges, others the volcanic isles, where fire and stone burst violently from the earth. When the Greeks looked upon jagged cliffs or sudden eruptions, they imagined the restless stirring of these ancient earthborn beings. The struggle between Olympians and giants came to be called the Gigantomachy. Like the Titanomachy before it, it was not a single clash, but a drawn-out contest. The giants hurled mountains as weapons, tearing them from the ground, while the Olympians responded with the strength of their newly established realms. Zeus sent thunderbolts, Poseidon stirred seas against the shores, and Hades kept the underworld sealed, ensuring no chaos seeped from below. Yet the Gigantomachy differed in one important way. Mortals, too, had a role. Some versions of the story tell that the gods could not overcome the giants without human aid. This detail, though small, was significant. It suggested that the cosmos was not a matter of gods alone, but a shared order, one in which humans, too, played a part. Even if their role was minor, it gave meaning to the bond between divine and mortal, a reminder that the struggles of the heavens touched the lives of those on earth. Though fierce, the giants were eventually subdued. Some were buried beneath mountains, their bodies pressed into the earth. The Greeks, hearing the rumble of earthquakes or seeing smoke rise from volcanic vents, imagined these giants still shifting uneasily below, their presence never fully gone. In this way, myth became a map of the landscape. The trembling of the ground was not random, but the restless stirring of ancient foes. If the giants represented disruption, then Typhon embodied chaos itself. Born of Gaia and Tartarus, Typhon was unlike any other. He was described as vast beyond comprehension, with 100 serpent heads sprouting from his shoulders, eyes that blazed fire, and voices that roared like beasts and men alike. Where the Olympians were many, Typhon was singular, yet his singularity was overwhelming. The birth of Typhon was said to be Gaia's final rebellion against the Olympians for casting her Titan children into Tartarus. Just as the earth could nurture life, it could also produce monstrosity. For the Greeks, this reflected an uncomfortable truth. The same soil that yielded crops could also crack open in quakes. The same land that supported life could swallow it without warning. When Typhon rose, the Olympians themselves wavered. Some myths describe them fleeing in disguise, transforming into animals to hide from his overwhelming form. It was a reminder that even gods could feel fear, and that no power was secure forever. Only Zeus stood firm, raising his thunderbolt once more. The clash between Zeus and Typhon was remembered as one of the greatest struggles in myth. Thunder split the skies, fire streamed from the monsters' mouths, and mountains shook under the strain. Yet even here, the battle was not swift. Zeus fought not only with power, but with persistence, as he had with the Titans. Bit by bit, he wore Typhon down, driving him back, striking again and again until the monster fell. In the end, Typhon was imprisoned beneath Mount Etna in Sicily. The Greeks believed that his fiery breath burst forth as volcanic eruptions, his writhing limbs sending tremors through the earth. Just as the giants explained the quakes of Greece, Typhon explained the fire of distant lands. Myth and geography intertwined, giving the world shape through story. What mattered in these tales was not only the victories themselves, but the lessons they carried. Even after triumph over the Titans, the Olympians faced challenge after challenge. Order was never permanent. It had to be defended, renewed, and remembered. For the Greeks, this mirrored life itself. Harvests failed, storms struck, sickness spread. Each victory over hardship was only temporary. Yet through persistence, survival continued. The reign of the Olympians, though secure, was not absolute. They had proven themselves against the Titans, the giants, and Typhon, but the very act of ruling meant constant vigilance. It was not a matter of erasing threats, but of containing them, burying them, or transforming them into parts of the landscape. The mountains, seas, and volcanoes of Greece were not just natural features, but reminders of past struggles, written into the world itself. As you drift with this story, you may sense its rhythm: conflict, victory, renewal, again and again. The Greeks, through these myths, expressed a patient acceptance of cycles. Nothing was ever final. Even gods had to face the persistence of disruption. And perhaps that is why these stories are strangely soothing. They remind us that even in the face of upheaval, balance can be restored, if not permanently, then long enough for life to go on. But one cannot help but wonder, if the Olympians faced such trials at the very dawn of their reign, what challenges might yet lie ahead in the ages to come? When the stories of the giants and Typhon were retold, they did not remain distant. For the Greeks, mythology was never only about the grand struggles of the gods. It was also about how people on Earth could understand their surroundings and find their place in a world that often seemed unpredictable. Consider the humdrum rhythms of an ordinary day in an ancient Greek community. A farmer might rise before the sun to tend his goats, climbing slopes that were rocky and uneven. If a stone came loose beneath his feet, tumbling noisily down a hillside, he could imagine that somewhere beneath the earth a giant stirred. A shepherd, guiding his flock near the base of a volcano, might look at the smoke curling against the sky and think of Typhon's fiery breath. These thoughts did not disrupt the day. Rather, they gave shape to it, adding an order of meaning to events that could otherwise feel random. The Greeks were attentive observers. They noticed how mountains seemed stacked one upon the other, and how valleys curved as though pressed down by unseen hands. Myths of battles, gods throwing thunderbolts, giants hurling stones, helped explain why the land looked as it did. A pile of rocks was not just a pile of rocks, but perhaps the remnants of some ancient clash. Festivals and rituals carried this memory too. In some cities, annual rites honored Zeus's victories, not as distant tales, but as reminders of his continued guardianship. Offerings of grain, fruit, and wine were given not only for abundance, but for stability, for the hope that order, however fragile, might last another season. The pouring of libations, slow and steady, was a way of acknowledging that even the gods had to renew their strength through remembrance. The story of Typhon especially left its marks. Sicily, where the monster was said to be bound, became a place of awe for Greek visitors. Travelers who saw Mount Etna belching smoke could point and say, "There, beneath, Typhon writhes still." To the Greeks, natural geography and myth were inseparable. One did not need to wonder why fire came from the mountain when one could say, quite calmly, that a monstrous foe of Zeus had been imprisoned there. This linking of myth to land was not dramatic, but practical. It was part of daily speech, part of explaining the world to children, part of remembering why things were as they were. Just as a parent today might explain a thunderstorm in soothing terms to a child, the Greeks used stories of Zeus's thunderbolts. The details mattered less than the reassurance. The world has meaning, even if that meaning comes from tales of ancient battles. In Athens, art and architecture preserved these memories. The Parthenon itself, centuries later, was decorated with scenes of the gigantomachy. Carved in stone, the images of gods striking down the giants were set above the city as a constant reminder. To walk beneath those carvings was to walk beneath the story, every day. And yet, to the Athenians, this was not high drama. It was continuity, a link between past struggle and present order. For those living in quieter villages, the myths were woven into simpler practices. A small shrine at the edge of a field might hold a stone figure of Zeus or Athena, placed there as a marker of protection. Passing by, a farmer might pause to place a sprig of herbs at the base, not out of fear, but out of habit. The offering was a gesture, acknowledging that order was always provisional and that it depended on attention. Even the telling of the myths themselves was often gentle. Around a hearth, after a day's labor, stories of giants and Typhon might be recounted not as fierce warnings, but as familiar tales. The listener would hear about how Zeus endured, how the gods prevailed, and would find reassurance in the repetition. The rhythm of the telling mattered, the pauses, the steady unfolding, the comfort of a story known, yet still alive. It is striking how the Greeks found ways to live with the idea that order was fragile. They did not deny the presence of chaos. They named it, personified it, gave it shape in Typhon and the giants, and then told of its defeat. But they never erased it entirely. The giants were buried, not destroyed. Typhon was imprisoned, not slain. In this way, chaos remained part of the landscape, a reminder that life could never be fully controlled. What may seem dull, the pouring of wine at a ritual, the carving of stone reliefs, the muttering of prayers before setting sail, was in fact the substance of how people lived with these myths. The Titans, the giants, and Typhon were grand in scale, but they were also folded into ordinary existence. Think of a fisherman preparing his nets. As he looked at the sea, calm in the morning light, he might remember Poseidon's storms and Zeus's power to restrain them. As he pushed his small boat into the water, he was not thinking of grandeur, but of balance, that order might hold long enough for him to return. The myth, spoken quietly in his mind, became part of his work, part of his calm, part of the way he explained the unpredictability of waves and winds. Even silence held meaning. Standing before a mountain, gazing at its immensity, a traveler might think of the giants buried within. The mountain's stillness was not just stillness, but the weight of a defeated foe. In that silence, the myth whispered, reminding the observer of the thin line between order and chaos. And yet, for all these reminders, the Olympians endured. Their reign was established, their order upheld, and their place in Greek thought secure. The Gigantomachy and Typhon's fall did not undo what Zeus had built, but strengthened it, proving that even when the earth itself rose in rebellion, order could prevail. Still, a question lingered. If chaos could never be fully destroyed, if it was always pressing beneath the soil or smoldering in volcanic fire, then was the reign of the Olympians truly permanent, or was it simply another chapter in the endless cycle of struggle and renewal?
As centuries passed, the stories of Zeus, the Titans, the giants, and Typhon did not fade. They continued to be told in homes, inscribed in temples, and depicted on painted pottery. But their meaning gradually shifted. The raw energy of battle, thunder, and upheaval softened into reflection. Greek thinkers, poets, philosophers, and dramatists began to ask what these myths were really about. For Hesiod, one of the earliest poets, the tales were woven into a framework of justice. His theogony gave order to chaos, setting out the genealogy of the gods as if to prove that even myth had a structure. For him, Zeus's triumph was not only the victory of one god over another, but the establishment of Dike, a sense of cosmic justice, of things having their proper place. The battles against the Titans and Typhon were remembered not for their violence, but for what they secured, a world where order had meaning. Later poets echoed this shift. In tragedy, the giants of the past became symbols of human hubris, the tendency of mortals to overreach. When playwrights described storms, fires, or sudden downfalls, they could hint at Typhon or the Gigantomachy without naming them, trusting audiences to understand. The myths lingered beneath the surface, much like the buried giants themselves. Philosophers, too, found lessons in these ancient tales. Heraclitus spoke of strife as the father of all things, reminding listeners that conflict was not simply destructive, but creative, producing balance. The memory of cosmic battles fit naturally into this view. Order arose not from peace,
but from the constant tension between opposites. In this way, the old stories were not abandoned, but transformed, carried into the realm of thought. Plato, centuries later, offered his own reflections. He suggested that myths, while not literal, contain truths about the soul and society. The struggle between gods and monsters became an allegory for the struggle within each human being. Reason striving to govern desire, justice striving to overcome chaos. When his students listened, they were not merely learning philosophy, but hearing echoes of the old fires of Typhon and the weight of the giants beneath the earth. Even in quiet rituals, the meaning shifted. Sacrifices at altars, once seen as gestures to keep chaos at bay, became acts of harmony, balancing human life with divine order. The gods no longer seemed endlessly embattled, but established, watchful, embodying ideals of justice, wisdom, or strength. Myths of violent rebellion softened into reminders of the need for moderation, what the Greeks called sophrosyne, the calm balance of life. This transformation was not sudden, nor was it uniform. In one village, Typhon might still be imagined thrashing beneath a mountain. In another, a philosopher might speak of him as a symbol of unruly passion. Both views coexisted, neither displacing the other. What mattered was that the myth lived on, serving the needs of each time and place. By the Hellenistic age, artists painted the Gigantomachy not simply as a tale of battle, but as an allegory for the triumph of order over chaos, reason over impulse. The scenes, once fearsome, became decorative as well as instructive. A viewer looking at a vase or wall painting could admire the detail, while also remembering that life, like the cosmos, required balance. Through this slow transformation, the myths became part of philosophy itself. They were no longer just stories to tell children by the fire, but texts to be studied, interpreted, and argued over. The Olympians' reign, once fragile, was recast as secure, and their battles retold as lessons rather than warnings. Still, beneath the polished words of philosophers and poets, the older pulse of the stories remained. When thunder rolled across the sky, it was hard not to think of Zeus. When the earth trembled, even a scholar might remember the buried giants. The myths had not lost their grounding in the physical world. They had simply acquired new layers of meaning. In this way, Greek culture carried both the vivid drama of the past and the calm reflection of philosophy. Violence and wisdom coexisted, as they always had, reminding listeners that even the most chaotic beginnings could be transformed into enduring lessons. And yet you listen. And yet, as you listen, one question lingers. If myth can shift and soften, carrying new meanings across time, then what do these old struggles truly say about the balance between chaos and order in the lives of those who came after?
The story of Greek mythology began with chaos, with the vast emptiness from which all else emerged. It traveled through the births of Dia and Uranus, the rule of Cronus, and the violent clash of Titans and Olympians. It lingered with the rebellion of giants and the terror of Typhon. And finally, it softened into poetry, philosophy, and ritual, where the noise of thunder became a lesson and the fire of mountains became a reminder. For the Greeks, these stories were never separate from daily life,
A farmer plowing his field knew that his effort was part of a larger order, one that the gods themselves had once fought to secure. A traveler gazing at distant mountains understood them not as empty rock, but as the resting place of ancient beings. The myths gave shape to the land, and the land in turn gave weight to the myths. Over centuries, the violent edges of the tales became gentler. Philosophers spoke of balance, poets of justice, and dramatists of the dangers of excess. What once had been battles between thunderbolts and monsters became allegories for the struggles within human hearts, the need for reason to guide desire, the need for moderation to temper ambition, the need for justice to restrain power. This was, in many ways, the quiet genius of Greek thought. It took chaos and shaped it into meaning. It acknowledged fear, but transformed it into reflection. The giants and Typhon, terrifying though they were, became part of a larger lesson, that order is fragile but enduring, and that balance is never permanent but always worth seeking. As you listen, you may notice how calm the rhythm becomes. These myths, once so full of thunder, end in silence. The gods, once at war, now sit upon Olympus, watching, ruling, embodying ideals rather than weapons. The earth, once torn open by battle, rests beneath your imagination, steady, firm, patient. There is a kind of reassurance in this journey. If even the gods faced chaos and overcame it, then perhaps the disruptions of ordinary life, storms, worries, restlessness, are also part of a cycle. Just as the Greeks found comfort in their stories, you too may find comfort in knowing that chaos does not last forever. The myths remind us that the world is both fragile and resilient. Mountains rise, seas shift, storms pass. Order returns, not because it is unchallenged, but because it persists despite challenge. Balance is not permanent, but it is possible again and again. When the Greeks looked back on these stories, they were not only remembering the past, they were also creating a way of seeing. Myth was not history as we would define it, nor was it mere invention. It was a framework for understanding life, for accepting that struggle and renewal go hand in hand. And so the reign of the Olympians stood as a symbol of endurance. Their throne upon Olympus was not merely a seat of power, but a vantage point from which to view the endless cycle: chaos, order, disruption, renewal. To remember this was to live with patience, to accept both storms and calms, both losses and returns. As this story closes, picture the quiet of Olympus at dusk. The sun settles behind the peaks, casting long shadows across the land. The gods sit in calm council, no longer in battle, but in watchful peace. Beneath the mountains, the giants shift faintly. Far below the earth, Typhon exhales fire, unseen but not forgotten. And yet, above it all, the sky is steady, the stars patient, the world at rest. This is how the Greeks lived with their myths, not as noise, but as rhythm, not as terror, but as pattern, not as chaos, but as meaning. And perhaps as you rest, you may carry that same rhythm with you, the reassurance that order, though never absolute, always returns. So let us leave the story here, with Olympus quiet, the earth calm, and the old battles fading into memory. For the Greeks, the lessons endured, and for us, they remain. The world is fragile, but it is also enduring. Chaos stirs, but order prevails. And balance, though fleeting, is always waiting to be found again. And perhaps you might wonder, as the Greeks themselves once did, if these myths still speak to us across centuries, quietly, steadily, what stories of our own world will endure to comfort those who come after?